The VP didn't just arrive, he landed like a budget airline flight coming in too fast, scattering papers, breaking the coffee machine, and making everyone slightly nauseous. Within his first week, he'd slapped Transformation Initiative on a dozen PowerPoint decks and started calling himself a change agent. His kind of change wasn't about fixing what was broken, it was about replacing anything older than his Spotify playlist. The first real collision happened in a Monday morning team review. We were all crammed into the glass conference room, the one that made you feel like a lab rat under observation. He plugged in his laptop, grinned at the room, and started tearing through our quarterly goals like he was hosting some reality TV makeover special. When he got to my section, the stability metrics for the platform's core APIs, he didn't even try to understand the charts. He just leaned back in his chair, pointed at my dashboard screenshot, and said, This is like a museum exhibit for repressed engineers. We're going to bring this dinosaur into the modern age." Laughter flickered in the room, nervous and brief. No one dared look at me. I kept my face neutral, fingers steepled, letting him bask in his own cleverness. Inside, my mind replayed a mental image of that dusty little ReadMe file sitting quietly in the repository, one he had never opened. The one that, if read, would tell him exactly why mocking me was a dangerous hobby. I'd seen his type before, all surface confidence and no depth perception. They think systems run on ideas, but they actually run on relationships. Vendor calls at odd hours, renewal negotiations slipped into trade show coffee breaks, quiet fixes no one ever logs in Jira. He didn't know the names of the people I called when a license hiccuped, or that those people picked up the phone for me, not for the company. As he clicked through to the next slide, tossing out phrases like sunsetting old tech and cloud-native migration, I caught a couple of my older colleagues glancing at me, eyes wary. They'd been around long enough to know the sound of someone tightening the bolts on a guillotine without realizing they're standing underneath it. The VP ended his presentation with a flourish, promising innovation sprints and total architecture refresh in the next quarter. I sipped my coffee, steady and calm, feeling the weight of the unspoken truth. He thought he was here to modernize. He was actually here to set fire to his own foundation, and all I had to do was let him strike the match. The whispers started before the paperwork did. I could feel the shift in the air, meetings about strategic priorities that suddenly didn't include me. Slack channels where threads went quiet the moment I typed, hallway conversations that ended with a polite smile and a closed door. The VP had been making his rounds with the executive team, feeding them his favorite line, that the company's growth was being choked by outdated architecture. I was the human embodiment of that outdated architecture in his mind. By the second month, he stopped pretending to consult me on anything. He'd call emergency innovation stand-ups without inviting me, then push out updates to systems I'd maintained for over a decade, as if I didn't exist. I didn't bother to fight it. Every unnecessary change he made was a thread pulling loose from the sweater. All I had to do was wait for the unraveling. The day it happened, HR called me into their small, beige-walled office. The director didn't even bother with a warm-up. Pushed a manila folder toward me like she was sliding a bill across a diner counter. "We've decided to move in a new direction," she said, with the kind of false sympathy you hear from someone reading a teleprompter. "Your role is no longer aligned with our innovation goals. No offer to transition my responsibilities. No request for knowledge transfer. Just a cold, clean cut." The VP didn't even show up. I half expected him to be leaning in the doorway, grinning, ready to deliver some smug parting jab. But apparently, he was too busy driving transformation to see the actual ignition point of his future disaster. I took the folder, glanced at the severance details, and gave a small nod. No questions, no protests. The HR director seemed almost thrown off by how quickly I signed. She probably expected bargaining, pleading, maybe even a flash of anger. But I had none of that, just the deep, steady satisfaction of knowing they were yanking out the keystone without realizing the arch was about to come down on their heads. I cleaned out my desk methodically, dropping a few personal items into a tote bag. No big dramatic scene, no teary goodbyes. A couple of the older engineers drifted by, eyes flicking between me and the VP's glass-walled office upstairs. They didn't say much, but the nods they gave me told me they understood. I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leaving loaded. Before I walked out, I opened my terminal one last time, not to make any changes, just to look at the dashboard. Every API was humming, every service green. The machine was at peak health, as if it knew it was about to be abandoned. I thought about typing a goodbye note into the company Slack, but decided against it. Let them discover the truth the hard way, on their own timetable. In my mind, I could already see the dominoes falling. The moment my employment status switched to former employee in the HR database, those license contracts would begin their silent countdown. Not immediately, no, that would be too obvious. They'd fail in sequence, days apart, giving just enough rope for the VP to hang himself in front of the entire company. When I walked out into the cold air of the parking lot, I didn't look back at the building. I didn't need to. I knew that somewhere inside. The timer had already started ticking, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Not now, not without me. It started faster than I expected. 48 hours after HR handed me that manila folder, the first API connection blinked out like someone had unplugged a life support machine. Not a graceful degradation, not a warning email, just a hard fail. The kind that stops services mid-transaction and leaves the end user staring at a spinning wheel of death. From what I heard later, the first 30 minutes in the office were pure confusion. Junior devs checking logs, thinking it was a network blip. A couple of them tried restarting services. Others ran trace routes like they were chasing down a ghost. Nothing worked. The connection was gone, not broken, not slow, gone. By noon, the failure had escalated up the chain. The VP strolled into the engineering pit with a confident smile, calling it just a hiccup, and telling everyone to focus on the bigger picture. He was still talking about his modernization roadmap, like losing one of our primary integrations with a top-tier vendor was as minor as a paper jam. I imagined some of the older engineers wanted to throttle him right there. I wasn't there to see it physically, anyway. I was at home, sitting on my back porch with coffee, watching the January light fade over the snow-dusted fence. My phone buzzed with a text from an old teammate. API G1 just dropped. No failover. He's calling it a glitch. This is bad. I didn't reply. The thing about those licenses was they weren't plug-and-play. You couldn't just spin up a new one like a cloud instance. Renewal channels ran through vendor reps I'd known for years, relationships built on quiet favors and middle-of-the-night troubleshooting calls. Half the time, getting a renewal processed meant skipping the formal queue entirely and calling someone's personal cell. There wasn't a chance in hell the VP or anyone else in that building knew who those people were, let alone how to get them to pick up the phone on a Friday evening. Back in the office, panic was starting to seep through the cracks. Without that API, certain client-facing features were dead in the water. Customers were calling support lines, tickets were piling up, and the sales team was demanding answers they couldn't give. And yet, from what I was told, the VP's official stance was that it was a good stress test for resilience. Sure, that's one way to describe a slow-motion car crash. I didn't feel vindicated, not yet. This was just the opening ripple. I knew the real storm was coming. The next expiration was already queued up, timed perfectly by the contracts themselves. In less than a day, another service would drop, then another. As I sat there on my porch, I could almost hear it. The faint click of the next domino leaning forward, gravity taking over. They'd built their future on a system they didn't understand, and they'd fired the only person who could explain it. Somewhere in that glass-walled conference room, I imagined the VP smiling for the board, still selling his transformation vision, completely unaware that the floor beneath him had already started to crack. And me. I just sipped my coffee and let the silence do its work. By the end of the weekend, the cracks had turned into sinkholes. The second API fell late Saturday morning, a clean sever, no error recovery. That one fed into internal reporting for half the finance department, which meant invoices, transaction reconciliations, and client-facing dashboards all went dark in an instant. I pictured the finance floor like a frozen river, people staring at blank screens, fingers hovering over keyboards, the first waves of stress hitting as they realized this wasn't just an IT hiccup. Sunday evening, the third API died. That one wasn't just internal, it powered one of our most visible client integrations. By Monday morning, the support queue was a war zone. High-value clients were calling their account managers directly, skipping the ticket system altogether, demanding to know why their systems were stalling mid-operation. Some were threatening penalties. Others were already talking about contract termination. The VP, from what I heard, was starting to sweat. Gone were the breezy one-liners about resilience and stress tests. Now it was closed-door meetings and tense Slack messages at odd hours. He tried to blame vendor outages at first, but the lie couldn't hold. Too many failures, too many different vendors. And each API had gone down in the same eerie, surgical way, as if someone had flipped a very specific, very deliberate switch. The CTO, who'd kept his distance during the VP's chest-beating modernization campaign, finally stepped in. He wasn't loud, but when he moved, people noticed. On Tuesday, he walked into the engineering floor, said one sentence, audit the repository, all of it, and left. That was the moment the tone shifted. I could imagine the engineers pulling up the codebase, clicking into the core modules they hadn't dared to touch since I left. Some of them probably hadn't opened those files in years. And there, buried in the structure, they'd find the ReadMe directory. Untouched, waiting. I didn't gloat, not out loud. But I won't lie, there was something deeply satisfying about knowing I was now the invisible center of their storm. My name wasn't being spoken in those meetings, not yet, but I was everywhere in that room. In every unanswered question, in every dead-end search for a renewal contact, in every half-remembered conversation about how we used to do it. Out in the world, I kept my routine, morning coffee, walk through the park, grocery run, but every so often I'd catch myself smiling at nothing, picturing the VP's growing desperation. He'd walk me out thinking he was clearing the way for innovation, and instead, he'd stripped the foundation out from under his own feet. The cascade wasn't over. The contracts were timed like falling dominoes, each one set to expire just far enough apart to keep them scrambling without reprieve. By the time the fourth and fifth APIs went dark, the board would be breathing down his neck, and the CTO would have that folder in his hands, the one that spelled out exactly why their museum exhibit was the only thing holding the place together. They wanted modern. They were about to get a real-time case study in what happens when you rip out history without reading the manual. And I was going to watch every second of it from the calm, quiet distance of someone who no longer had to clean up their mess. By midweek, the audit had gone from a quick sweep to a full-blown code excavation. Engineers who'd never so much as peeked inside the core modules were now digging like archaeologists, brushing dust off ancient lines of code as if they might uncover a lost civilization. And in a way, they did. The moment of discovery came late Wednesday night. One of the senior devs, a guy who'd been with the company almost as long as I had, clicked into a directory buried so deep in the repository tree it might as well have been in a different geological layer. Inside was a folder labeled simply /readme. Not readme txt like a rookie would name it, just readme deliberate, plain, impossible to mistake for an afterthought. He opened it and there it was, my quiet magnum opus. A document so simple in appearance it could have been mistaken for setup instructions until you started reading. No drama, no hidden insults. Just clear, methodical explanations of each core API license, who the vendor was, the exact contractual terms, and in every case, a clause stating that the license was bound to my continued employment. Not the company, not the engineering department. Me, by name, with signature dates and renewal schedules. In crisp, unambiguous language, it spelled out the chain reaction that would follow my departure. The licenses would expire sequentially, starting 48 hours after my termination and continuing until all dependent services had lapsed. I'd even detailed the renewal process, personal contacts, escalation paths, the informal handshake agreements that had kept everything running for over a decade. But without me, those paths were dead ends. The devs passed the file around like contraband. Some of them were impressed, others were terrified. But the CTO, he read it in silence, paragraph by paragraph, his expression hardening with each line. He knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't negligence. This was a structural truth baked into the DNA of the system. A truth the VP had bulldozed past in his quest to modernize. Meanwhile, I was at home, a glass of wine in hand, scrolling through a novel on my tablet. My phone buzzed with a short message from one of the engineers I still trusted. They found it. No context needed. I knew exactly what it was. I could picture the VP's face when the CTO walked into his office with a printed copy of my ReadMe. I imagined the shift from smug dismissal to dawning panic as he realized there was no fast fix, no get someone else to do it solution. The truth was immutable. He'd cut loose the only person holding the keys to his $50 million kingdom, and now the gates were closing. There was no malice in that document. That was the beauty of it. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a gotcha. It was just the facts. Facts he'd chosen not to learn, delivered in the calm, even tone of someone who had done the job well, documented it thoroughly, and walked away knowing the future would reveal the value of that work. Sitting there, listening to the hum of my refrigerator, I felt it settle in. Not glee, not revenge, just the deep, bone-level satisfaction of foresight paying off exactly the way I knew it would. By Thursday morning, the CEO's patience had evaporated. He wasn't a man who liked to be blindsided. Now his inbox was stacked with client escalation emails, breach of service notices, and a few carefully worded legal threats. The board had already called him twice before 9 a.m., each time with the same unspoken message: fix this or start updating your resume. So he did what CEOs do when the smoke gets too thick. He called an emergency meeting. Not a casual grab, a conference room meeting. This was the kind where the glass walls fog up with tension, where every chair is occupied by someone whose job is suddenly on the line. From what I later heard, he came in hard. The VP was already seated, pale and clammy, trying to look like he was still in control. The CTO sat across from him, stone-faced, with my printed ReadMe on the table between them like evidence in a criminal trial. The CEO didn't bother with pleasantries. He pointed at the document. "Is this true?" he asked, voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. The VP stammered something about legacy dependencies and unforeseen contractual nuances, but the CEO wasn't buying it. He turned to the CTO, who simply nodded once. No embellishment, just confirmation. That was all it took. The air in the room shifted. "Get her on the phone," the CEO said. "Now." The VP reached for his cell immediately, but the CTO stopped him. "She's not going to answer you." And he slid the phone toward the CEO. That was the moment the real power shift happened, when they realized I wasn't just the missing piece to their puzzle, I was the only piece. And they were right, I didn't answer. The first call came mid-morning. I let it ring out while I folded laundry. The second came an hour later. I was slicing vegetables for lunch. The third, from a blocked number, buzzed while I was halfway through a chapter of my book. Each time, I let it go to voicemail, not because I was playing hard to get, but because I wanted them to feel it. The silence, the waiting, the helplessness. By the fourth attempt, a text came through from the CEO himself. We need to speak. Urgent, no apology, no acknowledgement, just urgency. I put the phone face down on the table and went back to cooking. Somewhere in that glass-walled room, I knew they were pacing, arguing, watching more systems fail while their vendor contacts stayed silent. Every hour they waited for my response was another hour of chaos. Clients pulling contracts, revenue projections tanking, reputation bleeding out in real time. And all I had to do was nothing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't send a threat. I just let the clock run. By the end of the day, the CEO had left two more messages, each one more strained than the last. The VP, once full of swagger, was now a man living in the shadow of his own undoing. Control wasn't something I had to take back. It had already returned to me the moment they realized they couldn't move forward without my say-so. I didn't lift a finger, and yet the balance of power had flipped so completely that by nightfall, it wasn't me waiting for their decision. It was them waiting for mine. When I finally did call the CEO back, it wasn't because I'd run out of things to do. It was because I'd decided the timing was right. His voice on the line was tight, the kind you hear from someone trying to balance authority with desperation. He didn't waste a second on small talk. We need you at the all hands tomorrow, he said. Not would you be willing, not can we talk terms. Just a statement. I let the pause stretch. Why? Because there are things the company needs to hear, he replied, and I could almost hear him glancing at the VP in the background. From you, I agreed, but not without savoring the knowledge that this wasn't about reconciliation. This was about theater. The CEO wasn't trying to repair bridges, he was about to set the stage for a controlled detonation, and I was the fuse. The next morning, I walked into the all hands with the kind of calm that makes people nervous. The open floor was packed, rows of folding chairs in front of the stage, with the big projection screen glowing behind it. Conversations buzzed low, but everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. The VP was already on stage, fiddling with his laptop, his smile just a little too tight, his hands moving faster than they needed to. He looked like a man who'd been told to walk into a lion's den with a ribeye strapped to his chest. His usual charisma, the arm-sweeping, buzzword-spitting bravado, had been replaced with a brittle stiffness. The CEO stepped up beside him, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. There was no warmth in the look, just acknowledgement like two generals on opposite sides who know exactly how this battle is going to end. He picked up a thick sheaf of paper from the podium. Even from the back of the room, I recognized it. My ReadMe, printed in its entirety, pages clipped neatly together. The room hushed. Chairs squeaked as people shifted forward. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector. Before we begin, the CEO said, his voice carrying effortlessly, I'd like our VP of Engineering to share something with the team. Something we all need to understand about our systems. He turned and without ceremony handed the VP the stack of pages. For a heartbeat, the VP didn't move. He just stared at them like maybe if he waited long enough, they'd disappear. Then, with mechanical precision, he took them in both hands. From where I stood, I could see the sweat at his hairline, the way his jaw worked like he was grinding glass between his teeth. Every single person in that room, from the interns in the back row to the department heads in the front, could feel it. That electric, almost unbearable anticipation. Something big was about to drop, and everyone knew it wasn't going to be pretty. And I just folded my arms, leaned against the wall, and waited for the detonation. The VP started reading in that tight, clipped tone people use when they're trying to keep their voice from cracking. The first few lines were harmless enough, descriptions of API endpoints, vendor IDs, license renewal intervals. But then he hit the first clause tying an API license to my name, my employment, and my signature on the original contracts. A ripple moved through the crowd, chairs shifting, throats clearing as the implications began to take shape. He kept going. The second license. The third. Each one bound in the same way. Each one already expired or in countdown mode. Every sentence was a blow he had to deliver to himself in front of the entire company. By the middle pages, the color had drained from his face. He was sweating now, his hand gripping the paper like a lifeline. The more he read, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a legacy quirk or some unfortunate oversight, it was the backbone of their business. And he'd snapped it clean in two by shoving me out the door. The CTO sat off to the side, arms folded, eyes locked on him with the cold focus of a man who'd warned the driver there was a cliff ahead. The CEO stood motionless, expression unreadable, letting the VP twist in his own noose. Paragraph by paragraph, my calm, professional prose laid out the entire disaster in plain English. No malice, no threats, just the reality he'd refused to learn before making the biggest mistake of his career. The renewal contacts he didn't have. The vendor relationships he'd severed without even knowing they existed. The timelines for each API's automatic shutdown, all now in motion. By the time he reached the final paragraph, his voice was shaking. The sentence was simple. In the event of my departure from the company, all licenses herein will lapse according to the timelines specified above. Continuity of service requires my active employment status. He stopped reading for a second, like maybe if he didn't say it out loud, it wouldn't be true. But the CEO gave a small nod, and the VP forced the words out. When he finished, the silence in the room was absolute. No coughs, no whispers, just the faint hum of the HVAC and the sound of 100 people processing what they'd just heard. I didn't smile. I didn't smirk. I simply met his eyes from across the room, just long enough for him to know that I knew and then looked away. The damage was done. No public apology, no emergency hire, no frantic vendor calls could undo what had already unraveled. He had walked me out thinking he was clearing the way for progress. Instead, he dismantled his own platform, piece by piece, in full view of everyone who mattered. And now there was no putting it back together. I turned toward the exit as the CEO dismissed the meeting. Behind me, the VP was still holding the papers, hands trembling, looking like a man who just realized the museum exhibit he mocked was the only thing that kept the walls from collapsing. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.